Greetings, traveler. As a game designer, it's always daunting when you have to put elements inside the UI for your game. So today what I want to do is give you a two-step framework for designing basically any UI you will ever need, even if you're not a graphic designer, an artist, and so on. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now, and this was always a topic that daunted me. I always thought I was good with thinking about rules and cool ideas and monsters and stories and so on, and visual things were the work of visual artists. However, as I realized when I was working on a certain soccer project, artists really cannot create a UI out of nothing. You can't tell them, oh, I'm making a soccer game or a racing game or whatever, and expect them to come up with a UI for that. Usually what they will do is copy another game out there and ask if that's what you want. But in my experience, that always led to somewhat mixed results. So instead, I came up with this two-step framework of basically ignoring any difficulty around UI, also ignoring the huge temptation of just copying another game, which is not inherently bad, but it usually puts us, rather makes us inherit all the design choices of that game, which might not be appropriate for our game. So let's jump in and let's look at this two-step framework, specifically if you're not a visual artist that you can use. So it only has two steps. Step one is deciding what is necessary for any given screen in the game, and two, deciding where to place it on the screen. So I know you want a practical example of this, so let's jump in. All the information up here, so the ammo, the fuel, the resources, HP and map, are information that I believe that would be important for the game that we're currently developing. So this game is a game where you're flying around in an airship and doing combat, exploration, and stuff like that. So this is a third-person camera game. So you're looking at your ship from the outside, and the camera can freely look around the world. So when you're doing the exploration, I was thinking, first of all, what is this list? We need to come up with this short list of information that we need to put on the screen. Of course, as game designers, we want to put all of the information always and forever, but that would just clutter the screen, and it would make the player's choices more difficult to make, because the player wouldn't have the information he needs to make the choice as quickly and as easily as possible when playing the game. So from all the possible information we could track, so player position and number of crew members and I don't know, sine waves of the Earth's magnetic whatever, I decided that yes, this is good, but if I have to come up with the absolute smallest amount of resources and stats that I could put on the screen, what would those be? And that is the first step, coming up with the absolute minimum list. That list needs to be so small that if one of these elements were missing, then the game simply wouldn't be able to function and the player would be lost. So making sure that we have the absolute minimum in the list here is definitely a good starting point for this. So after we come up with this list, then the next question is the second step of the framework, which simply says, well, now that we know what we need to show the player, where are we going to show it? And here is usually where the process gets complicated, because especially me in the beginning of my career, all I could do was look at other games for inspiration, right? Look at how other games are doing it and try to emulate it. But as I mentioned, that just makes you inherit all the problems and all the design decisions of that game, which is not really a great idea. What it boils down to is when the player has to make a decision, what is that decision? So in our case, where to go next, which enemy to chase, or how to run away from an enemy, how to make a decision about how far you can explore, how many resources it's going to cost, and so on. That is a good list of questions to keep in mind about how this whole UI for the game is going to be used. And once that's in your mind, once you have a list of all the use cases this UI is going to be used for, then you can think about the second step, the placement of all these values. So here the most important thing, the thing that I wanted to start from, was the combat, right? So everything else around the game is of course important, but it can be done in a more relaxed time horizon compared to combat. When combat happens, you need to have all the information available right now, right? So for that, I decided that having the information about ammo, since reloading is another important part of the game here, having the information about ammo and if you have enough and if it's ready and so on is the most critical thing when you're doing combat. And when you're doing combat, targeting is very important in this particular game. So the target is at the middle of the screen here. So that's the piece of the UI that the player will be trying to adjust before he makes every shot to the enemy. So this is common for most shooting type games. So the target will always stay at the middle of the screen, no matter where you move the camera. So since the target is always going to be there, having the information about the ammo that you currently have should be readily available there. You shouldn't have to look at some other part of the screen to know if your reloading finished, if you have enough ammo, and so on. This is a critical piece of information because if the player doesn't have enough ammo and he tries to shoot, then of course the shot is going to be very ineffective. If he sees that he doesn't have enough ammo to make the shot, perhaps it's a better strategy to run away from this particular fight rather than to stay engaged in it. So very high pressure situation, very time-based decision that the player has to take here. That's why we keep all this information here. So for the rest of the values, they are just as important, but the player has more time to look at them. So then the question becomes, well, do we want to keep them all somewhere close to the center of the screen? Can it be on the side? What's going on with that? Here, one important thing to keep in mind is that since this game is about exploration, as I mentioned, or rather exploration is important here, and combat is important, being able to see the world around you is important. So if this was a management game, for example, perhaps you wouldn't have to see the immediate surroundings of the player. Perhaps you could just issue a movement order and then go back to looking at some other information. But in this case, looking at your immediate environment is very important. So even though we took this decision to keep the target and the ammo at the center of the screen, we try to do it in a minimal way, and we try to provide as much open area around this to the player to be able to look at the environment. So the map, though, is another important feature. You want to be able to have access to the area that you cannot see, essentially. So perhaps that's behind the player, or perhaps that's beyond what the player can see in their immediate surroundings, maybe further away or behind them or behind some obstacle. So that is important information. And one way of deciding what this important information is asking the opposite question, right? So if this element wasn't here, would the player still be able to perform the tasks that are necessary? So in this case, the map also helps because it gives the player additional information for what objective to pursue next. So maybe the player is looking around and he doesn't see anything interesting to engage with, but if on the map you can see there's a resource close by, or there's an enemy closing up on you, that very much informs your next step and what your next objective should be. So the map is definitely useful in this case, so it is an element we want to keep in this screen. At the same time, I mentioned that looking at your surroundings is very important in this case. So yes, having the map up here so it doesn't obscure what you're looking at right now is a good choice. But one way to improve it just a little bit further, and I know many games do this, is make the map itself semi-transparent. So if there is something important behind the UI element here of the map, the player still has a chance of seeing it. And finally, we have up here the fuel and the resources, as well as the hit points of the player. And here you might be wondering, okay, yeah, the resources up here we see in many games, right? Also fuel, it's an important resource, but it wouldn't, like with hit points, wouldn't it be more important to have it closer to the center of the screen rather than up here? Yes, perhaps. And there's nothing that says that this one UI layout is the only UI layout available in this case. Of course, there's many variations that fulfill this criteria. In this case, hit points, the way we've playtested them, they're important, but it's something you look at before engaging in a fight. So if you think you have enough hit points to engage in the fight, then you go for it. Otherwise, if you think you're low on hit points, you don't engage in that fight to begin with. Now, if you're in a fight already, if you get ambushed by an enemy or suddenly start combat, then you know you are locked in combat. So whether you have hit points remaining or not is actually not part of your decision making. And this is something we found with playtesting, of course. So if you have to fight either way, whether you're ready to fight and whether you're reloading and the heading of your ship and so on, where your cannons are looking at, is way more important because you know you're committed in the fight. When you're out of the fight, you can take a look at your hit points and decide if you want to repair your ship or head back to the workshop or do something like that, and decide ahead of time if you want to go for the next engagement or not. And with fuel, it's a very similar situation. If you're exploring, then you don't need to have the fuel always at the middle of the screen, because you can take a look at it up here and see if you should be heading back for refueling, or you should be hunting for fuel in other places. It's something that's not very time critical. With fuel, in fact, there is something you might say that, well, if you're running out of fuel and it's not in the middle of the screen, it's information that might be very easy to miss. And you would be correct in saying that. That's why one of these things that we added here was some alerts to let the player know that, this information that you're not really looking at very often might be important in some situations. So when the fuel drops below a certain percentage, there is a little alert that goes off to let the player know that they should start thinking about refueling. But still, that's an alert and it's an audible sign. So keeping all this information up here is both informing the player that all these things are at these current levels, and it's keeping the screen as clear as possible for the player to be able to look around and to decide the next objective. So this is just an example. I know there's many different other types of games out there. I know there's many crazy UI choices and many artistic UI choices out there, and there's nothing wrong with going the artistic approach. But I found that if the element being designed is something commonly found in other games, then it's actually to the designer's benefit to use the conventional approach. Why? Because most people are used to it, and when they see that UI element, like the map here, which is a very conventional approach, they immediately know what it means, they immediately know what to do. While if you have a crazy menu with revolving choices and colorful buttons and so on, that's not a bad choice. It's just that the designers have to spend the extra time to teach the player step by step what this new UI element is, how it behaves, and why is it important. If at the end, like for experienced players, this UI actually makes things faster and easier for the player, then perhaps it's a good idea to sit down, think about this crazy new UI, say that, yeah, it's more complicated and it's unconventional, but once the players learn it, they're going to have a much better time. If they decide that that's worth it, investment-wise, then yeah, that's maybe a good way ahead. So it's not to say that these things should never happen in games, but If the conventional approach can be used, then it saves everyone time and it makes gameplay for the players easier. And thinking in this two-step framework basically frees you from thinking about how other games are doing it, or since we're making a game similar to that, we should have the same type of UI. Perhaps, but thinking about absolutely the minimum number of stats necessary and comparing to where they should be placed in the screen compared to all the other features that need to be featured in the screen, in my experience, leads to the most efficient placement of everything around the screen. And whether this is a conventional choice or not, there is always reasoning behind it. And as long as this reasoning exists, so we put this in the center of the screen because we think so and so and so, this is a logical argument that can be had within the team, and everybody can offer their experience and their knowledge in this discussion to make the game as good as possible. And engineers can pitch in, and of course artists can pitch in. People who are not involved in the development at all can pitch in and say, but in that, what happens in that case? Or like, when I play so and so, I find that I need this extra information. And of course, these are opinions we want to hear. We want to qualify as much as possible. And if these conversations offer a viewpoint that we didn't consider when designing this, of course, this is a great time to include it in our design, because the game hasn't been released yet and we can make these adjustments. So anyway, that wraps up this very simple two-step framework. If you're someone who is really afraid of this or has never designed a UI before, it's really not that scary, especially if you're still working on a new game, or it's just a gray box prototype that your game exists in. Moving these things around is extremely easy. It doesn't require any work from any artist if you're on the gray box step. So feel free to experiment with this, take elements away, add elements here, see how busy or how light and elegant your UI can get, and perhaps this will inform what will work best for your game. Anyway, I hope this is helpful for at least one other traveler out there. If you're curious to see how our UI turned out for our game, I'll be happy to talk about it. So feel free to use the link below to talk with me about it. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And as always, have fun.